Okay, I hope we're back. I hope we're working this time. Good. Alright, quality looks good. Quality seems to be okay. It seems to be working. Connection strong. Cool. Yeah, we'll see how many people start showing up here, and then we'll get started, for sure. If it's a small number of people, depending upon who's here, maybe we can focus this a little bit more, but ideally still give you a bit of textual analysis to brighten your Sunday. In the meantime, I suppose I'll continue with this. So how is revision going right now? Has anyone started working and fixing their paper and have any questions that have been bothering them since Friday? Alright, well, why don't we go ahead and get started, and if people show up, then that'll be fine. If not, then hopefully everyone will watch this later, because there's plenty of help to be had here. So let's go ahead and dive in to this article that I asked you to read. I posted it on Canvas, like I said. It is titled Detective Stories from Sherlock Holmes to Whitechapel. I'm not even going to make an attempt at the author's name. I would butcher it completely, and that would be terrible. So I won't embarrass myself with that. But let's talk about this article a little bit. I said that as you are getting better at this idea, at this particular skill of analysis, that you're going to need less opportunity to summarize an article, and ideally you're going to get to a point where you can put together a fairly comprehensive summary in roughly 3 to 5 sentences. So I've got a couple. I did a summary in 2 sentences of this article. Basically, the main point of it, what it's trying to accomplish, but we'll talk about that also specifically. So for those of you who haven't looked at it yet, who don't know what the article is about, here's a short little summary for you. Using the ideas of masculinity presented by scholars like Sussman, the author tries to establish detective stories as putting male-male bonds as replacements for traditional familial intimate relationships. Using Sherlock Holmes and Whitechapel as his evidence, the author looks at how Victorian-era England viewed relationships and what roles were filled by male partnerships at the expense of male-female bonds. So, in other words, the author was talking a lot about how male writers in Victorian literature tended to substitute male interactions for your traditional marriage, male-female interaction, using Sherlock Holmes, using a book from more modern times as an example, after he set up this premise and presented the facts accordingly. So remember that that's the first thing. Like we said weeks ago, there are 3 things that you need to do in order to tackle an article, in order to start working with it and tearing it apart or breaking it down. The first one is you have to know what the article's saying. You have to be able to provide a solid summary of the article, and ideally you will need significantly fewer and fewer words to do so. The second thing is that you have to understand what the article is doing. You have to understand what it's trying to accomplish. So, the purpose of this article is actually laid out pretty well on both page 1 and 2 in the very last sentence of the abstract in the first paragraph. Both his thesis and the purpose that he's trying to get at. Specifically, the quote would be that the purpose of this paper is to probe and grapple with the similarities and dissimilarities of the detective genre from Sherlock Holmes to Whitechapel by focusing on the detective himself, the crime types, criminals, their motives and ethnic origins, masculinity, and male-male bonding. In other words, he wants to lay out the similarities and differences. He wants to compare and contrast detective stories from 1888 to 2010 using the normative approach to masculinity found in Victorian men's writing. I hope that that's clear. I know it could sound a little convoluted, especially if you haven't read a lot of Victorian literature. If you haven't read a lot of detective literature, then certainly you might not be able to understand all of it. What's important to understand from it, though, is that it is a compare and contrast, or ideally, at the end of this article, the author will have done a compare and contrast between Sherlock Holmes stories and this Whitechapel book from 2010. Now, did he or did he not succeed at this? Well, that's the question, that's the ultimate question you're going to try and answer, and you want to get at that third step now. How is the author achieving that purpose, and why does that matter? Why do we care? So, I said that I would go through the 6 big categories that we mentioned in class. Structural, stylistic, rhetorical, ethos, pathos, logos. Give you an example or two of each kind being used in this particular article, the ways that they're being used, what impact that has, how that helps to accomplish goals, all of the above, any of the above, whatever, in order to give a fair and balanced look at analysis and the kind of thought process you should be having for your particular paper. Right off the bat, it's worth mentioning that his goal was ultimately unaccomplished in this article. Given the tools that I'm going to discuss, the goal was to compare and contrast, and unfortunately, he never really got around to that. That second thing, Whitechapel, if you read the article, then you know that it wasn't even mentioned, it wasn't discussed at all before page 9 of the article. And then it ended pretty quickly. It was 2-3 paragraphs-ish of discussion on Whitechapel, really just 3 paragraphs of summary telling you nothing about it. So that being the case, there wasn't an actual compare and contrast done. So if the purpose was to do so, it wasn't accomplished. So how did he actually go about trying to accomplish that goal? Well, let's make sure that everyone's with me so far. If you have any questions, now is the time to use the chat to let me know so that we can make sure everyone's on the same page before we move forward. Okay. If we're good so far, then let's get started on the rest of it. I want to start with the big three. I want to start with that, like I called it, that umbrella of analysis elements, the structural, stylistic, and rhetorical. All three were present here. There are examples of all three, and you can see them working in this particular essay to try and accomplish that compare and contrast goal. Like I said, ultimately failing to accomplish that goal. So we'll go ahead and start with the structural. Pages 2 and 3 are good examples of structure being used. The author is starting his discussion with a setup of this idea about masculinity and the detective story and what they mean and sort of how he's going to be defining them throughout the entire discussion. So, in the sense of needing to give your reader context in order to provide a foundation from which to actually build or achieve your purpose, the structure is working. The examples are there. The summary is not. He's not trying to summarize, what every single scholar said about these issues, or even what the books or texts that he was ultimately using are saying at this point. Just establishing the context so that the reader can move forward with some sort of understanding. As he goes along, he provides an overview of Sherlock Holmes and what Holmes is all about, and different texts that Holmes is involved in, different short stories, different books, to introduce that first element, that first part of the compare and contrast. Up till now, he's actually achieving his purpose pretty well, because for anyone who has written a compare and contrast before, you know that it's all about how the two sides, how two different things are similar and different, just like he laid out in his purpose. So in order to accomplish that, you have to set up one, you have to make sure that it's clear how one of those things is related to the ideas you're putting forth. Then you'd have to do the second one, and then you'd have to talk about them in conjunction with one another. You would have to give a sort of overview of how they are the same, different, all of that, in order to make it clear, in order to persuade a reader that that's what you're actually doing. So up through the discussion of Sherlock Holmes and up through the presentation of information, he's doing a pretty good job of achieving his purpose, or it seems like he's going to be able to do so. Now, where the structure gets problematic and where the structure is an issue for that goal is towards the end. Like I said, the discussion of Whitechapel, the second half of this compare and contrast, doesn't even get started until page 9. On page 9, there are 2 paragraphs of summary about what this is, the series Whitechapel. Then there's 1 paragraph where Holmes is brought up in conjunction with Whitechapel, although that's it. That's the entire discussion on this series. That's the entire discussion of that second half of the compare and contrast. There's no real look at how these masculinity elements, these bonds, these connections are also present in Whitechapel, at least not in the same way that was done for the Sherlock Holmes half of it. There's no genuine, prolonged discussion about how the two sides are similar or different. And if the ultimate purpose was to achieve that compare and contrast, then it fails. Because you need both sides. You need that dichotomy. You need that presentation in order to get that. So the structure is problematic. If, on the other hand, it had been put together in a way where, if you remember from the thesis, he mentioned that he would discuss the detective, the crime types, the criminals, masculinity, and male-male bonding. If, for instance, he had broken the paper down to discuss each of those at a time and took one of those, for instance, masculinity, and discussed Sherlock Holmes in terms of masculinity, then discussed Whitechapel in terms of masculinity, then compared them, contrasted them together as he was having that discussion, that would have been significantly more effective. That would have actually achieved the purpose. So the way that the structure of the article was put together ultimately hindered and ultimately prevented the author from achieving the purpose he claimed that he would by the end. Any questions about structure or about that sort of breakdown analysis of that one element? Okay, then we'll go ahead and look at stylistic elements next. For this article, a big stylistic thing was the use of block quotes and lists in order to make points clear, to really present examples in a way that gives the reader a sense of these masculinity elements. I should say, too, if you have questions as we're going along, feel free to ask them. There's a little bit of a lag on my end, and so if you ask them, I can stop and answer them and then go back to the discussion. So don't think that you can't ask questions as we're going along here. Well, structure is, I mean, that's what we were talking about, the physical structure of it. I mean, the physical structure can be a thing, and certainly, um, like how, like all the subheadings. I know a lot of people in the textual analyses I've seen and what I heard, um, the sections, how many paragraphs, things like that, that can be structural elements. But remember, structural is, more generally speaking, just how it's put together. That can be the section, that can be how it's sectioned off, but that can also be what I was talking about, what order things are in, whether or not that order is being used effectively, how that order could be put together a different way. I mean, there are many, many, many different things that fall under each of these categories. So, yes, how the piece is sectioned off is certainly a valid one, but that's not the only structural way that you can look at an article. Yes, it's more about how the piece is put together and if it accomplishes its goal. That can mean many different things, and there are definitely, depending on the article, there are different ways to look at that. I mean, if you looked at this article, there are no subheadings. It's just one long thing. So the structure is going to be different, or the way we discuss structure is going to be different than if there were several subheadings involved in it. Okay, so getting back to style, the author relies pretty heavily throughout on large block quotes and lists to present his information, to give focused easily digested examples of the concepts he's mentioning. For instance, on page 3, he talks about Coelte's list of the plot devices for the classic detective novels: introduction, crime and clues, investigation, announcement and solution, explanation, and denouement. Yeah. That, add to that, page 4, you've got a block quote from Sherlock Holmes stories. You've got another big one on page 6. You've got more on page 8. These are stylistic elements. These are a method for providing focused example, for giving the reader a clear, extended look at exactly what point is trying to be made. And that can be effective. That does help to achieve purpose. If you are trying to present certain ideas, if you're trying to show how something is working or how something is present, then yes, either the more example you have or the more focused, specific, extended example that you have will help to build that purpose, will help to achieve or persuade that that is the case. So that's one stylistic approach that's actually being used effectively. Another stylistic element here is actually a good example of how, when we discussed these, we mentioned that some of the examples don't have to be limited to one category. Sometimes it can fit in both structural and stylistic, or both structural and rhetorical, or both stylistic and rhetorical, and be fine depending upon how you use it. The way the paper is set up, the way that the discussion happens, focusing on one story first, or one element, the Sherlock Holmes stuff, and then moving to the Whitechapel stuff in order to achieve the goal, is a stylistic choice as much as it is a structural choice. It was a means of presentation that the author decided would work best for the goal that he set out to accomplish. He chose to make sure the information happened in that particular order, presented in that particular way, put together or presented aesthetically so that it flowed from one point to the next, to the next, to the next, in order to guarantee that he was presenting the information the way he wanted to. It could be a stylistic choice. If the article is all opinion, then that could be a stylistic choice. That could also be a better thing to look at for, say, pathos or ethos, rather than trying to get big and broad with stylistic analysis, though certainly it works. You know that opinion generally gets at the author's credibility, and there's usually some sort of emotional appeal involved in that. So ethos and pathos might work better as part of a discussion if the article is essentially all opinion. Especially if there aren't a whole lot of facts in it, because then you can talk about that in the logos, or in a logos discussion as well. Okay, in that specific instance then, yes, that would be a style. Well, that might actually be a better thing to discuss as part of a rhetorical analysis, because that is a use of language, that presents a very unsure opinion or a very unsure way of thinking about the particular issue, it's usually suggested to all those who start writing academically that you leave out words like may or might or iffy sort of words like that, because it shows weakness in your argument and it hurts your purpose. So the word choice there might be a better thing to discuss as part of a rhetorical look rather than a stylistic look. Unless, of course, you can make it work for style. Like if the purpose of the article is to present an unsure look at the topic, or to make it seem like the topic is very open-ended or very wishy-washy in its own, then the language might be a stylistic choice to help get that across. It would depend entirely upon the article. But, okay, I see what you're saying now in terms of the specific example. It could work for stylistic depending upon what you see. It definitely would work for a rhetorical analysis, given what one is supposed to be accomplishing or attempting to accomplish in an academic article. So let's talk then yes, if you're going to talk about both, then include both in the thesis. So let's talk about rhetorical then. Since we mentioned it, since we brought up rhetorical analysis, we can talk about it in terms of this article. As you remember, rhetorical analysis involves the word choice, what's on the page, the actual words being used. One of the big, or maybe the biggest rhetorical element used in this article is the repetition of key words. Right up front, immediately after the abstract, the author mentions 4 prominent keywords: detective genre, masculinity, Sherlock Holmes, and Whitechapel. Ideally, those would be showing up anyway given his purpose, but the repetition of them throughout the article, especially that masculinity one, focusing there, making sure that it is completely and totally clear that this element, this masculinity, is present and accounted for in Sherlock Holmes and influencing the way that he approaches relationships with Watson, with women, with any other character. The repetition itself is trying to establish those particular words, those particular ideas in the minds of the reader, so that the connection to that greater purpose, so that it's not lost that there is something being accomplished or something that is trying to be accomplished here. And if that is maintained throughout, if the connection, if the thought is there in the reader's mind at all times, oh, there are these 3 words, 4 words, masculinity, 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 oh right, that's what he's talking about, that's his big thing. He's going to get to comparing and contrasting that to Whitechapel here soon. Okay, it sticks with you. It's a decent way to achieve purpose because it gets the reader to keep thinking about that particular idea, keep it in the forefront of their mind as they're proceeding through the actual paper. Now, it works on its own, and it works to a certain extent here. If it was by itself, if this was a very much only use of rhetorical devices in order to create purpose and achieve purpose, then it probably would have worked very well. But if you're putting together your paper and you discuss, say, structural and stylistic first, and then you get to rhetorical, it's okay to say, as I'm going to do now, that on its own it might have been effective. But given the discussion that's already taken place, given the fact that both structural and stylistic failed in this article to achieve the purpose, the rhetorical element can't save it. Especially when you get to the end, when you get to that page 9, page 10, and these keywords, masculinity and, well, masculinity especially, is almost non-existent. Like, it disappears. The notion of masculinity as it was discussed in the context of the Sherlock Holmes stories disappears in the discussion of Whitechapel. So with that in your mind, not even the rhetorical device on its own can save the purpose that this article is trying to achieve. So rhetoric fails as well, and ultimately that purpose is not achieved in any real way using those three large umbrella categories to look at this particular article. All right, I'll let you ask other questions you might have, and then we will turn to ethos, pathos, and logos as another method for looking at this particular article. Okay, if we're good, then how do you rate a thesis when doing an analysis on an article that you think didn't accomplish its goal? I mean, the same way that you would if you think it did accomplish its goal. Your thesis should, in some way, discuss whether or not it accomplished its goal. For this particular article, I might say something like, or depending upon what elements I want to look at, I'll just take the structural, stylistic, rhetorical one. The thesis might be something along the lines of, the author attempted to use structural, stylistic, and rhetorical elements to achieve his purpose of presenting a compare and contrast between Sherlock Holmes and Whitechapel. However, that purpose was ultimately unsuccessful as these elements were used in a way that complicated the presentation of both sides throughout the article. It's all in how you word it. Your thesis should mention in some way whether or not the author accomplished his or her goal. So whether it did or didn't, you can say that in your thesis statement. Okay, so we'll look then now at ethos, pathos, and logos, because all three as well are presented in this essay. All three are used. All three work in different ways, but like with the three before it, they don't help to actually accomplish purpose. Remember, we'll start with ethos. Remember that ethos is all about establishing credibility. It's all about the author proving in some way that he or she is qualified to be discussing this subject, qualified to be talking, writing about this particular idea. We don't know a whole lot about this particular author, other than it was, or this paper, other than it was presented at a conference at Karabukh University. I cannot tell you where that is off the top of my head, but it doesn't particularly matter, because as we were saying, I know I said this to several classes on Friday, you are more concerned about credibility as it's established in the article itself rather than what the author might have done outside of this particular article. One of the big things that hurts credibility, that makes it hard for the author's point to get off the ground in this article, is that it is riddled with errors. Not mistakes of fact or mistakes in use of information per se, but just proofreading errors. I don't know if this appeared in a different language or not and something got lost in translation, but there are several errors throughout that should have been easy to catch through proofreading, either by the author, by the journal, by somebody. An example, in the abstract and in the first paragraph, those last two sentences, when we come to 2010's a bestseller, Whitechapel hinges on the same lone detective trying to pursue the killers and criminals. You can hear that there's something wrong there. There should be a comma, or maybe two. There's something missing. Similarly, in the next sentence, the purpose of this paper is to probe and grapple with the similarities and dissimilarities, the detective genre from Sherlock Holmes to Whitechapel by focusing on the detective himself. Between dissimilarities and the detective genre, there's something missing. There's punctuation or a conjunction or something is not there. In the second paragraph on page 2, there are some shifts in verb tense that aren't used properly. There's punctuation again that's missing. Later in the paper, more of them show up. There are a lot of errors throughout that really do a number for credibility, especially if credibility is supposed to be all about establishing the author's ability to discuss this subject. I know it may just be me, it may be something that influences only me as a reader, but if there's a lot of mistakes, then it makes the point harder to understand, it makes it harder to take your point seriously, because they are things that a professional, especially someone who's writing a paper for a conference, someone who's writing a paper for a journal, should be able to catch for the most part. I mean, one or two spread throughout a 12-page article is one thing, but 4 or 5 in the first 2 paragraphs is pretty bad. So that's a big thing with credibility. And then if there's a lack of effort to make sure things are working properly and done properly there with that sort of technical element, the purpose is lost, or the purpose is all but lost, because it's just hard to take it seriously if there's clear evidence that the author wasn't even trying to make sure it was as precise as possible. The other thing that the author did not do that hurt credibility, that hurt his establishment of authority, was in the actual use of information. This week in class, we are going to be going over how to properly incorporate sources into your papers, how to properly be looking at, or how to properly be using them, how to properly include them in the actual body of your text. We've already talked about making proper citation, notation to show where you're getting information from, to make it clear what information is being used where. When this author gets into his actual discussion of the topic of Sherlock Holmes, he starts mentioning several scholars and their work with Victorian literature or with Holmes literature, or the connections, that male-male bond, whatever it is. But he doesn't always make it clear what sources he's using and where. For instance, on page 4, he's saying something about Doyle's colonial others served to justify Britain's imperial expansion by conjuring images of Anglo-cultural superiority, but also express anxiety about the supposed danger surrounding contact with non-Western cultures. That doesn't really seem to matter. At no point before that is he using a source, a scholar's work, to discuss this sort of notion of Western culture, non-Western culture, and the other. That wasn't supposed to be even one of the things that he mentioned in order to support the criminals or the crime types. I mean, I know he mentioned ethnic origin, but ethnic origin and non-Western or British imperial mindset are very different things, and so the use of sources there was not particularly effective. Another example is on page 5, where the last paragraph, or the last sort of half paragraph there on page 5, it says towards the bottom, in fact, his book deals with the concept of masculinities in the 19th century in terms of the implication of multiple forms of the masculine in the period. From context, I think you're supposed to understand that he's still discussing Herbert Sussman's book on Victorian masculinities. But one of the biggest issues in this particular paper is that the use of in-text citation is so weak, is so non-existent. First of all, I can barely tell what style he's actually using. Second of all, it's been a while since he mentioned any particular source other than quoting Sussman there, so it can only be assumed that that's who he's talking about. But if it's not made clear, then you don't know whether or not to take his point seriously. You don't know whether or not you should believe it, because if he can't cite properly, if he can't give the authority to back up his point and make it 100% clear whose authority is being used and where and how, then what reason do we have for assuming that he's done the research and done it effectively? I mean, if you look at his bibliography alone, there are countless sources that are never mentioned in the paper. Now, most styles do not require you to use every source in the paper that you actually looked at. You would list those, all of them, on the works cited or the bibliography references page, but then you may only use a few in your paper. However, when you have so many points like this article does that just seem to go unsupported, a few more wouldn't have hurt you, regardless of whether or not you needed to use all of those references in the actual body of your paper. So when your goal is to achieve a compare and contrast, and you can't get your sources straight or you can't be bothered with proofreading, there's a big problem establishing that ethos element in the paper as a whole. Okay, so we'll move on then to pathos, that emotional appeal. The emotional appeal in this particular article is kept to a minimum. There is no real emotion one way or another. It's a very neutral presentation of information to allow the facts or the connections between the sources and then ideally between the two texts in question to speak for itself, independent of the need to play on a particular emotion set or the need to present a particular kind of emotion for the reader. And that's good because when you're doing a compare and contrast, the nature of the facts, the nature of the information should speak for itself. There should be a clear, precise, neutral presentation of here's what one thing is doing, here's what the other thing is doing. You can see that they're similar or you can see that they're different, and here's what that means. You don't need a whole lot of emotional appeal. Now, again, like with the rhetorical analysis before, on its own, that works. On its own, that's great for a compare and contrast. But the discussion of Whitechapel never appears, never materializes in this essay. So ultimately, the purpose is left unachieved. It could have been done really well. It could have been presented in a fair and meaningful way that did great things with these ideas. But because that second half of the compare and contrast never showed up, the purpose wasn't achieved, and even a strong pathos or a strong lack of pathos where there needed to be one couldn't save that. So I'll stop briefly then here in order to let people ask questions if they have them. Otherwise, there wasn't much else to say about pathos, so we would move on to the logos next. But if you have questions now, please do ask. Okay, then we will look at the last one here, logos, and the use of logic, and the way that logic is presented in order to establish or try to establish the purpose of this particular article. Again, it's worth repeating that certain elements of an article can work for different analytical tools. The biggest one is how now the same sort of structure that is presented for a structural analysis method can be used to discuss a logos appeal as well. Most importantly is that this article has a very logical progression to it. It moves from its introduction, setting up these concepts and the idea that there's going to be a compare and contrast. It then talks about the masculinity element, which is going to become a big keyword, buzzword throughout. Then it presents what the main plot points of a detective story are. Then it talks about how the detective story, the Sherlock Holmes stories, are presenting masculinity and using that idea in those elements. So for much of it, there's a very logical progression. Now, like we said, the only thing missing is that discussion of the second half for the compare and contrast. The logical progression is still there. You can argue, and it would be pretty easy to argue that it's fine that the next logical step was then to do Whitechapel alone, looking at these concepts, and then to look at both of them together. You could also argue that the logical progression would have been going back to that structural aspect and how you do the discussion of masculinity from both of them at one time so that you guarantee the compare and contrast is there. And then you move on to a different kind of element, like in the thesis, he said he was going to talk about the detectives, the crime types, the criminals, the male-male bonding, all of it. There were 5 major points that he was going to outline and use and help to build this compare and contrast. And certainly that kind of logical progression would have worked too. Both of them are fine, and both of them work. And until you get to that last little bit of this particular article, the logic is there. You follow it. There's no hard time in going from point A to point B to point C to point D. It's just that after point D, point E is never there, and point F is non-existent in its entirety. So the progression works, and the progression would have helped. The progression would have been a great thing for achieving purpose. However, like we said, once you've gotten to a point where you've understood how all these things are working together and being used not only individually but also being used as a whole, even one thing being done right or one thing that was almost done right won't save the ultimate achievement of purpose in a particular article. Another way that logic was being used was the effective and ideally what you're going to do in future papers for sure, using outside sources, using other scholars' work to cement facts, to cement ideas in a particular way or in a particular context. Using the definition of a detective story, using the definition of masculinity, using the presentation of particular examples in order to establish and maintain a logical way of thinking about a particular concept, a particular thesis, or to achieve a particular goal. Everything was set up to be used very well and very effectively in this article. And it's a shame that that last bit never happened, because it would have changed the entire scope of its presentation here. So, as sort of a final thought to this particular article and this particular analysis, something like what you might put in a conclusion to wrap up your discussion, I would say that on the whole, I agree entirely with the author's premise. I agree entirely that Sherlock Holmes, the nature of masculinity, these male-male bonds, the presentation of characters, all of it's working exactly the same as the author suggests. If you haven't read a lot of Sherlock Holmes, I would recommend you do. They're very good books. They're not your typical detective stories, but they're still classics, and you should be familiar with them, and it might make some of the points in this article make more sense. But as part of the audience that has a background in Sherlock Holmes and has a background in academic writing and academic presentation of information, while I see what he's getting at, I also see that he's not finishing this compare and contrast. He's not putting it together in a way that works. Half of it's not done at all. The important part where you actually compare the two or contrast the two never is once presented in this article. So, as much as I agree with the premise, as much as I agree with the issue itself, and this is a good thing to remember, you can agree with the issue, you can disagree with the issue, whatever you want. But at the end of the day, for this particular assignment, we do not care whether or not I agree with the issue of masculinity or the male-male bonds in the Sherlock Holmes stories. What's important is whether or not the author achieved his purpose, and he did not. So the tools that were used to go about it were ineffective, were not used to their full ability, and that purpose was left sitting there with no real discussion at the end of this particular article. And that would be the sort of larger conclusion, the sort of wrapping up that you might put in your body and then again in your conclusion paragraph to put something of a bow on your actual discussion of the article, of this particular text, of whatever text you're working on. So, what questions do you have right now? What questions do you have about the whole thing, about what you're doing? Does it make a little more sense? Do you feel a little more comfortable, confident with what you're doing for this particular paper? I mean, it's fine to help everyone. I mean, the profile is an independent paper. It's not its own, or it's its own thing. It's the skills are being worked on in the textual analysis as well, but it's a different skill set. It's a different kind of paper. So just because you don't do well on one doesn't mean you don't, or you can't help people with another. I remember, Dalton, from your draft on Friday that you were doing a lot of things right. So that's likely what people were hoping you could help them with. And certainly getting help from your classmates, creating a dialogue with the other people in the classroom who are going through a same experience at the same time is in a lot of ways better than just coming to me for consideration. Because there's no guarantee that if I tell them what to do, they're going to understand it any better than they did before. I mean, certainly we've been over the concept of textual analysis and the different ways to do it and different examples and looking at drafts and practice ones and all of that countless times now in the last 3 weeks. And there are still people who don't get it. There are still people who it just isn't clicking for. So if they can find another resource, if they can ask someone who it did click for to say, hey, what worked best for you? Is there a way that I can make that work for me? Then certainly that's fine. But I mean, it's also fine to say, come ask me, because I will answer questions to the best of my ability here for the next couple of days before the final draft is due. All right, what else? Now's the time to ask questions if you have them. Okay. If everyone is good for now, then we will end it there. I hope that this was helpful for working through your draft here the next couple of days before the final is due Wednesday evening. Please do use all the resources available to you. If you have questions, I'll answer them. I'll take drafts for the next day-ish so that I have enough time to get you feedback in a relevant way before the paper's due. But please keep working on them. Please keep trying to get at this concept so that you can use it and develop it further as we move forward, because we are talking about your next paper this week. We are going to start talking about that because this one's coming to an end, so it's time to switch gears and start thinking about the next. We still got a few weeks before that's going to be due, but it's time to think about it and start talking about it. So please keep working with the textual analysis, and I will see everyone tomorrow morning, hopefully.